Another important aspect of habitability is planetary mass. Smaller planets are much more likely to lose their atmospheres. Atmospheric loss occurs through a number of processes. First, there's the process of thermal escape. In a gas, the average speed of the particles is determined by the temperature of the gas and the mass of the particles. However, there's variation in speed that follows what's known as a Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution. And this variation arises because as individual molecules collide with each other, they gain or lose energy. These two diagrams show, on the left, the same gas at different temperatures, and on the right, two different gases, oxygen and hydrogen, at the same temperature. So what you can see is that at a lower temperature, most of the particles are travelling at lower speeds. And as you raise the temperature, more and more particles travel at higher speeds. But there are still some that travel at the lowest speed. Similarly for oxygen, which is a heavier element than hydrogen, the molecules travel at lower speeds. What's important to notice is that because of this Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution, there's always a substantial tail of molecules that will have a higher speed than is average for the gas. Now, the escape velocity of a planet is the velocity required to escape its gravitational pull. This is, of course, determined by the mass and the radius of the planet. Planets with lower mass have lower escape velocity. If a particle is travelling above the escape velocity, it will be able to escape the atmosphere into space. And the general rule of thumb is that the average speed of a gas is that if the average speed of a gas is about 1/6 that of the escape velocity, there will be a significant number of molecules of the gas travelling above the escape velocity. Earth loses the light elements hydrogen and helium through this process of thermal escape. Mars, which has a much lower mass and therefore lower escape velocity, loses a number of other elements. Another mechanism of atmospheric loss is sputtering by the solar wind. As particles of the solar wind bombard the atmosphere, they transfer energy to atmospheric particles, causing them to escape. On Earth, the problem of sputtering is substantially reduced by the strong magnetic field that deflects charged particles of the solar wind. However, as we noted earlier, magnetic fields are generated by motions of liquids in the planet's core. Smaller planets cool down and solidify much more quickly, which shuts down their magnetic dynamos. That's exactly what has happened on Mars. Mars no longer has a global magnetic field because it seems to be geologically dead. It's cooled down too quickly. Smaller planets cool down quicker. Finally, there is the process of sequestration, which is the loss of molecules from the atmosphere to the interior of the planet. Now, to explain this, it's worth understanding the link between plate tectonics and the carbonate-silicate cycle. The crust of the Earth is split into 7 major plates, which float on the mantle. Here's a map showing the major plates of the Earth. The movement of these plates is responsible for continental drift, mountain building, earthquakes, volcanism, and so on. This image shows what happens at the boundaries where plates meet. There are 3 possible ways plates might relate to each other. First, plates might be moving away from each other, as in this part here, this is known as a divergent boundary. Plates can be sliding past one another, and that's known as a transform boundary, or they can be moving towards one another, which is depicted here, and that's a convergent boundary. Convergent boundaries create what are known as subduction zones, where one plate is pushed under another, as you can see here and here. So that's very briefly plate tectonics. This is linked to what's known as the carbonate-silicate cycle, and this is an image showing how the carbonate-silicate cycle works. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere mixes with rainwater and forms carbonic acid. This is a weak acid. but over time it erodes silicate rocks. This process is called weathering, and it releases cations such as doubly ionized calcium into rivers and oceans. In these water bodies, the cations bind with bicarbonate ions to form carbonates such as calcium carbonate, depicted here. These carbonates fall to the seafloor and they're buried, and in that way carbon dioxide is removed or sequestered from the atmosphere. However, due to plate tectonics, the material is subducted and it melts in the earth, and it eventually is released back into the atmosphere through volcanic eruptions. On a planet without plate tectonics, that's geologically dead, there would be no mechanism for restoring these atmospheric gases. They would gradually be sequestered permanently, leading to atmospheric loss. So for various reasons then, it looks like we'll generally be looking at planets with a larger mass. It is worth noting, though, that atmospheric loss can be mitigated by other factors. Titan, one of Saturn's moons, is much smaller than the Earth, but it still retains a thick atmosphere. It's actually about 1.5 times denser than the Earth's. Exactly how Titan has retained its atmosphere is still controversial, and it is relatively unusual in the solar system for its thick atmosphere. But clearly there are ways of mitigating atmospheric loss. But generally speaking, smaller planets are going to be less hospitable for life. As well as preventing sequestration of the atmosphere, plate tectonics and the carbonate-silicate cycle are important in other ways too. The carbonate-silicate cycle is one of the primary means of temperature regulation for the planet. As I'm sure you're aware, carbon dioxide is one of the primary greenhouse gases. If you have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the Earth heats up. A consequence of higher temperatures is an increase in the rate of chemical reactions. If things are hotter, chemical reactions proceed at a faster rate. So that the weathering of silicate rocks proceeds at a faster rate when temperatures are higher. And this increase in the rate of weathering results in increased carbon dioxide consumption. Carbon dioxide is taken out of the atmosphere at a faster rate, and with the carbon dioxide being taken out of the atmosphere, the planet cools down. Conversely, when the planet is cool, you have slower rates of chemical reactions, so lower rates of weathering, and this means reduced consumption of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide gradually builds up in the atmosphere as it is released by volcanoes, and the planet heats up. So the carbon-silicate cycle is a crucial mechanism for regulating the planet's temperature. I should note that this cycle is something that operates over millions of years. Humans are pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a rate far faster than it can be regulated by weathering. So this cycle is not going to prevent climate change or anything like that. One of the important long-term changes is the gradual increase in solar luminosity, as I mentioned earlier. When the Earth was first formed, the Sun was 30% less luminous than it is today. So this increasing solar luminosity produces an increase in temperature, but it's compensated for by the increase in weathering rates, which reduces the concentration of carbon dioxide. It keeps the planet at a stable temperature. Furthermore, it's believed that in the past, the Earth has experienced so-called snowball Earth episodes, during which it was entirely covered by ice. This happens because there came a point where the planet cooled down for one reason or another, and the cooling of the planet increased the extent of polar ice. Since ice is more reflective than water and land, the planet then absorbs even less heat, so it cooled down further, and the ice extent increased further, which then produced further cooling. There's a feedback effect of cooling. This rather catastrophic state of affairs was reversed by the release of carbon dioxide from volcanic eruptions. Since the planet was frozen, there was very little weathering, building up carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Without that build-up of carbon dioxide, it's not clear that the Earth could have escaped from the snowball state. So you can see that it seems that for a planet to be habitable in the long term, you're going to need something like plate tectonics and the carbonate-silicate cycle in order to keep the climate conditions and environmental conditions stable and to regulate things like temperature. Another thing that may influence habitability is the presence of a giant planet further out in the planetary system. Obviously, in our own solar system, we have Jupiter, and Jupiter is believed by some to play an important role by deflecting asteroids or comets that could otherwise pose a threat to Earth. I should note that this role has been disputed in recent years. A study by Horner and Jones, titled Jupiter, Friend or Foe, found on the basis of computer simulations that a planet of the mass and distance of Jupiter actually doesn't make any difference to the impact flux on the Earth. Indeed, a giant planet with slightly smaller mass, or perhaps significantly smaller mass, such as Saturn, was found in the simulations to be worse than no planet at all. Having just a Saturn-sized planet in the orbit of Jupiter actually increased the impact flux on the Earth. So it's somewhat controversial, the role that giant planets actually play. But it certainly is true that in the wrong place, a giant planet could cause problems. Many of the exoplanets that we've discovered so far are so-called hot Jupiters, which are giant planets of about the mass of Jupiter that orbit very close to their stars. We've also found many giant planets with highly eccentric orbits. These kinds of cases could be very problematic for the orbits of any terrestrial planets in the system. So, we'd be looking for planetary systems where the giant planets are either absent or at least very far out so that they don't disturb other planets. Another suggestion is that habitability may be promoted by our large moon. The Earth's moon is unusual in the solar system because of its size relative to our planet's size. All other moons are significantly smaller than their planets. Some astronomers even refer to the Earth-Moon system as a binary planet system, rather than a planet and a satellite. The reason why our moon is so large is due to its unusual history. On the current model of the origin of the moon, it was formed when the Earth was impacted by another planet, about the size of Mars, and the debris from this impact gathered to form the moon. The reason why the moon has been suggested as important for habitability is that it stabilises the axial tilt of the Earth. The axial tilt is shown in this image. It's this bit here. It's also known as obliquity. And it's the angle between a planet's rotational axis and its orbital axis. So, this here is the orbital plane of the solar system. And the planet rotates along this axis here, so the equator is here. The axial tilt can change over time, and one proposed effect of the moon is that it stabilises the axial tilt. If the axial tilt were too large or too small, or were to vary too much, this would lead to sudden and extreme variations in the climate. Which, while compatible with microbial life, would make things very difficult for complex life. Without the moon, it's thought that the axial tilt might vary from 0 to 85 degrees, much more so than it does today. It's about 23 degrees. Now, as with the case of a large outer planet to deflect asteroids, the influence of a large moon is controversial. More recent studies by Jack Lissauer, Jason Barnes and John Chambers in their paper Obliquity Variations of a Moonless Earth suggest that without a moon, the axial tilt would wobble only by about 10 degrees around its present angle. And we might also wonder whether extreme variations in the climate really would be such a problem for complex life. We know that there are, on the Earth today, generalist species that can survive in many different environments. Perhaps a planet with a highly variable climate would see selection for species better able to cope with sudden changes. Species like rats, for example, I think can survive in all sorts of environments, and you see that with species that sort of benefit from human presence. Humans radically alter the environment, but actually many species have benefited from that. So it's not obvious that extreme variations in the climate couldn't be accommodated by selection. Furthermore, an argument made by Rory Barnes is that by inducing substantial climate change, variation in axial tilt might be one way of preventing situations like the snowball Earth scenario. It might prevent a planet from permanently freezing over in a runaway cooling. So again, there's a lot of debate here about the importance of a giant moon. Okay, so earlier in the video I mentioned this concept of the rare Earth hypothesis, according to which there are a variety of individually improbable conditions required for the emergence of complex life. And so it's maybe worth summing up some of the conditions that have been proposed. We have the circumstellar habitable zone, the galactic habitable zone. We're looking for a planet that is of the right mass, a planet that has a magnetic field. We need something like plate tectonics and the carbonate-silicate cycle. Somewhat more controversially, perhaps we need a giant planet in the right orbit, and perhaps we need a large moon. At least if we want to have complex life, arguably all of these conditions are required. And certainly, it may be the case that these are somewhat improbable. Definitely with things like a large moon, that is, it would seem fairly improbable insofar as it required a large impact event. But one point that might be worth bearing in mind here is that these conditions may not be independent. So we've seen that one aspect of habitability is liquid water. We sort of operate on the working assumption that liquid water is required for life. But plate tectonics is, arguably the chances of plate tectonics are increased by the presence of liquid water, because water acts as a lubricant which allows the plates to slide and subduct. Arguably, one reason why Venus has no plate tectonics is just because it's too dry. So the point is that although these conditions may look individually improbable, they're not independent. Having one of them increases the chances of having another. Similarly, if you have plate tectonics, you're almost certainly going to have a magnetic field, and your planet is almost certainly going to be of the right mass. And so maybe that would mean that the Earth isn't so rare after all. But that's something to consider. Now, before we end, I'd like to mention the notion of superhabitable worlds. This is the proposal that there could be worlds that are more habitable than the Earth is. Now, this is a somewhat vague notion. What exactly does it mean for one planet to be more habitable than another? Well, the thought is that some planets can perhaps support a greater biomass, or perhaps support greater complexity and diversity of organisms than other planets can. It's possible that life exists on Mars in a few tenuous habitats, but clearly this would be very simple life. Certainly the Martian surface is completely barren relative to the Earth. The Earth is more habitable than Mars by many standards, in terms of the biomass that the Earth sustains and in terms of the complexity of life we find on Earth and the different forms of life. It's more habitable. Arguably, there were periods in the Earth's history when it was more habitable than it is today. During the Carboniferous period, the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere was much higher, and this led to organisms of great size and enormous forests that blanketed the continents. One aspect of superhabitability then is higher oxygen concentration. If you have higher oxygen concentration, it looks like you can support greater biomass. Could there be worlds that are more habitable than Earth in other ways? It's been suggested that some so-called super-Earths, which are rocky planets with a larger mass than the Earth, might be super-habitable. Because of their larger mass, they would have greater gravity, and this greater gravity would produce a thicker atmosphere and, importantly, a flatter topography. This could lead to an archipelago planet dominated by shallow oceans with lots of islands. These kinds of areas tend to have the greatest biodiversity on Earth. When you look at islands and shallow ocean areas, the islands tend to provoke rapid selection and diversity of life. But what we also find on Earth, of course, are huge regions of arid deserts, frigid ice-caps, open oceans with very little biodiversity. There are huge areas of our planet that are only barely habitable. So an archipelago planet could, it seems, sustain greater biomass. Another consequence of greater mass is that the planet would retain more heat, probably producing a stronger magnetic field, hence better shielding from cosmic rays. Although note that we wouldn't want too much mass, because by about 3 times the mass of the Earth, the greater pressure and viscosity in the mantle may prevent plate tectonics. And furthermore, as the mass increases, it makes it harder to shed the hydrogen and helium in the atmosphere, which would mean it would remain a gas giant. Some of the observed exoplanets have very, very low densities, suggesting that they retained their gases. We might also look for worlds around K-type stars. These stars have slightly lower mass than the Sun. They emit less damaging ultraviolet radiation than the Sun, and they're on the main sequence for longer than the Sun, around 15 to 30 billion years, compared to only 10 billion years for the Sun. Any habitable planet around one of these stars would be able to sustain life for much longer than the Earth can. This is important for the development of complex life. As we noted earlier, the emergence of complex life took a great deal of time on this planet, so the longer you have, the better. So that's all for today. I hope you found that interesting. Thanks for watching.